I am here to help you help yourself, to help them help you. Yeah. If you are hiring or thinking about hiring someone to mix and master your song, whether from an online service or a local studio, this video is for you. Believe it or not, there is a lot that you can do as both the artist and the customer to make sure that you're not the reason your song turns out. I am going to show you all the tricks to get your money's worth. I'll show you how to maximize preparation, organization, and communication so that you and the mixing and mastering engineer can get that shared mental model to create a fire final product. Psst, I have a secret. Here's the all-encompassing truth. The first mix ain't gonna be the final mix. If you expect this to happen, it's not. And if it does, it's luck. Here's the main 4 categories set as chapters in this video. Chapter 1, engineer selection. This is huge. Chapter 2, pre-export communication. This is huger than huge. Chapter 3, exporting stems and assembling your final project file. This is what separates the men from the boys. Chapter 4, revisions. This is where the magic happens, and this is the hardest step for most people to get right. Let's get saucy.
Saucy.
Chapter 1, engineer selection. For Chapter 1, we're going to take a look at genre specialization, mixing and mastering as a combined or separate service, research tips to find out who's right for you, and timeline. Genre specialization. Anybody can call themselves a mixing and or mastering engineer, so be careful. Plus, not all mixing and mastering engineers are good at all types of music. For example, someone who's good at working with high impact samples and synths, like in EDM, might not be the best at working with live instruments like with country music. In contrast, the country music professional might not know what to do with all that bass in EDM. Lastly, some engineers are better at processing vocals than others, and some even offer additional vocal processing services. Combined or separate service. The big question is, do I hire for mixing and mastering as a combined or separate service? Bottom line, it's easiest for you, although it may or may not be the best, to find someone who does both. Separate services are often going to require you to be the middleman. Both experience and sometimes just the amount of free time that you have can be deciding factors. Online services like Fiverr have automatic time constraints, especially in regards to revisions that you will have to keep up on. If you feel confident with the work of both the mixer and the masterer, then go for it. If you're gonna split the work, talk to the mixing engineer and ask if they're willing to make edits based on the results from the mastering engineer and vice versa. Of course they should, but you should really clarify the process. Research. Your job is to do research. If you're using services like Fiverr or SoundBetter, take the time to go through tons of profiles, listen to tons of samples, and read reviews. It might be helpful to listen to a song from your favorite band or artist to compare to. When it comes to revisions, remember the all-encompassing truth. The first mix ain't gonna be the final mix. Pick engineers that offer revisions. Most do. Sometimes it's related to price. If you're spending more than $300, I would opt for at least 5. In a perfect world, you should get as many as you need to get things perfect. But at the same time, the engineers don't want to get screwed. Their time is money. In my experience, if you're going for perfection, 7 is a pretty good number to hash out all the minor adjustments. Also remember, if you're in a band, everyone in the band may have different ideas about the revisions. Ah, the joys of butting heads in a band. When I choose someone, I'm ridiculously picky. What I listen for is whether I think the engineer has a solid grasp on the entire frequency spectrum, and if they seat things in the mix to give it an overall cohesive sound. Timeline. Reach out and make sure that they have the time that fits your project for your timeline. Sometimes having to wait an extra week or 2 or more is okay if it's worth it. It just gives you that much more time to work on that promo content that you've been procrastinating on. Chapter 2, pre-export communication. Once you've found someone you want to work with, pre-export communication is the communication you do before you export your stems, before you send them anything, and before you pay. This really is a huger than huge step. Rule number 1, be humble, be kind. This is a business transaction. I apply the same golden rule that I apply to playing live shows. Be nice to the sound guy. If you're friendly and professional with the sound guy, they are much more likely to put love and care into your mix and make you sound better. Too many artists are cocky and lame at communication. Even if you're a professional musician, you're still a dime a dozen. If you're only getting mastering done, pre-export communication is fairly simple. But when it comes to mixing, this is a highly detailed and very important step. Here's a list of key questions to ask before you export your stems. We're going to go into each of these steps in detail. Who is panning the tracks? How much headroom do they want you to leave? Do they want tracks dry, wet, or both? To what degree do they want you to remove EQ and compression? Do they care if the stems are in stereo or mono? And what format do they want them in? How are vocals going to be processed, especially in regards to auto-tune? Do they charge extra for this? We already touched upon it in the last chapter, but be sure you are clear on how many revisions you get. Panning. Ideally, the engineer is going to do the panning in the mix themselves, but there may be some instances where it doesn't hurt if you do it. Either way, ask ahead of time and give them guidelines. Also remember, if you have things panned in your rough mix, you're probably going to have to unpan them before you export your stems. Headroom. Headroom is how far below 0 dB on your master channel that the loudest part of the audio registers. Again, this applies to your master channel, not your individual track volume. Many engineers don't actually care about headroom as long as the track isn't clipping. In chapter 3, we're going to get more into the ins and outs and do's and don'ts. Personally, I aim for negative 10 dB. To be honest, sometimes I'm just making extra work for myself. I'm a tad snobby. Dry versus wet. This is a big one. Whether or not engineers want tracks with the effects applied seems to vary greatly. We're not talking about EQ and compression. I'm talking about effects like phaser, chorus, reverb, delay, etc. There's 3 options here. Dry tracks, no effects at all. Wet tracks, effects applied, and both, which is one set of tracks dry and one set of tracks wet. Just remember, more tracks often equals more money. Your budget could be a factor, and another reason why pre-export communication here is important. EQ and compression. The reason EQ and compression were not included in the previous effects category is because usually EQ and compression are done to fix audio in terms of the overall mix. Most mixing and mastering engineers will want you to take off EQ and compression, especially those on your buses and your master channel. So I generally go by this rule. If I'm using EQ and compression for audio and tonal shaping, I leave it on. That is, to make the audio sample sound how I want. If I use EQ and compression in terms of how it's going to sound in the final mix, especially in regards to frequency separation, ask, but 99% of the time, it's going to get shut off. Stereo versus mono. Most engineers don't really care if you send them stereo or mono files. Although keep in mind, some effects are in stereo, and sometimes you don't even have the option to export to mono. As a general rule, stereo is always the safest route. File format. 99.9999999% of the time, engineers will want you to export to a 24-bit 48 kilohertz WAV file. The master they send back to you will probably be in that format. If you export everything to 24, 48 stereo WAV file, you can't go wrong. Vocals. Editing and processing vocals can be time consuming. This is why some engineers charge extra for vocal processing services. Every project is different. Every engineer is different. Some offer pitch correction, some don't. Sometimes it just comes down to budget and the accuracy of the original takes. Don't guess here, communicate ahead of time. It's that simple. Chapter 3, exporting stems and assembling the project file. As with the previous chapter, if you're just getting mastering done, this process is much easier because you're just sending them one stereo file, maybe a reference track, and maybe some notes. When it comes to mixing, this is a major step that you'll want to pay attention to. You want to give the engineer the best project file possible. Your project file for mixing is going to contain all your stems named properly and organized into folders, your track list document, a reference track of your song, and an optional reference track of a current song that you want your mix and or master to sound like. In order, we're going to cover the 2 types of reference tracks, exporting layered samples, ones that combine to create one sound, naming and organization of your stems, creating the most badass track list your studio engineer has ever seen, considerations and techniques for exporting to a set headroom value, a personal bonus tip, and assembling your final project file. Reference tracks. There's 2 types of reference tracks. First, there's a rough mix of your song, which you should include if you can. It doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be in the ballpark. It really helps with the shared mental model and gives the engineer a quick idea of relative track levels. It doesn't really have to be in WAV format, it can be in MP3. And secondly, most engineers will ask for a reference track of an already published song that you like the final mix of. This is not required, but it's highly recommended, especially if you're doubting your studio communication jargon. As examples, I made a list of what I consider to be some very solidly mixed and mastered band songs and albums to give you ideas and help you get started based on genre. If you're a rock or hard rock band, you might like the Super Unknown album by Soundgarden or most of the releases from Five Finger Death Punch. If you're doing rap or hip hop, most of the stuff released by Kendrick Lamar or Hopsin sound great. If you're a metalcore band, check out the Death of Me album by Polaris or the Eternal Blue album by Spiritbox. If you're an EDM person, you might want to go with everybody's favorite classic, Sandstorm by Darude. I think that's how you pronounce it. I googled it, it didn't help much. If you have a synthwave track, most of the releases by Gunship are fantastic. Layered samples. Layered samples are when you have more than one set of tracks that come together to make one sound. The most common example of layered samples are with drums. If you see here, I have 2 sets of tracks for this bass drum that make one final bass drum sound. So should you export these as combined or separate stems? The general rule that I usually follow, and probably the most common occurrence, is that if you like the way the combined samples sound, apart from using EQ and compression in terms of seeding that sound into the final mix, export them as one combined stem. Proper naming and organization of your stems into folders. This is where the engineer will greatly appreciate your service, as it will make working on your song much faster and easier. It puts your level of competency and professionalism way above the rest, and will greatly help you later with revisions, which we will cover in the next chapter. Name all your stems in a consistent format that is easy to understand and makes sense for the song. Different songs can call for different techniques of organization. Here's 2 examples. The first example is from the first track that I released on my lo-fi channel. It has a total of 40 stems, which is average, but maybe a little heavy for a lo-fi song. It is pretty epic, but as far as organization goes, 14 of those 40 stems are unique to just the outro. With that in mind, it made the most sense to give the outro section its own folder. And thus, I organized my stems and folders in that manner as shown here. An instruments folder, an outro folder, and a percussion folder. The percussion folder has 11 stems. My instruments folder has 15 stems. You can see my dry wet designations and some of the titles as an example from what we went over earlier in the effects section of chapter 2. Then over to my outro folder, which has the 14 stems. It made the most sense to make stem titles simple, clean names. We'll see a different method of doing titles in the next example. This second example is part of my top secret EDM song that I'm gonna release shortly. It has 69 stems total, including vocals, and has a full song format. Chorus, verse 1, bridge, chorus, verse 2, bridge, outro. The main 3 folders I have are drums percussion with 25 stems, instruments with 20 stems, and vocals with 24 stems. In this song, there were various instrument and percussive sounds that were unique to these different parts of the song. So it made the most sense to include part names in the titles. Because this method makes for a more complicated title, I specified my stem title format in the notes of the tracklist document. Which, hey, we're gonna get into that right now. Tracklist document. Once you have everything properly named and organized, it's time to make an immaculate tracklist document. Again, it raises your professionalism and competency way above the rest. Using the same 2 song examples that we just went over, here's how my tracklist looked based on the organization of those folders. Example 1. The title portion has song title, the beats per minute, the time signature, and the key of the song. You won't always have the beats per minute, but for anything that was recorded matching the click track of your DAW and thus the grid, this is great information to include for speedy editing. You can see here I also included the chord structure. For this song it was extra information, but if you're having someone do vocal tuning for you, it can be helpful. Depending on the complexity, you may or may not have a general notes section. This one was fairly simple and didn't need much. Next, I have a separate, clearly marked section for each folder, and within each section I have my stem titles, which, very important, are written verbatim to the actual sound files. I put a stem count total for each folder and also made a note regarding which tracks have been split into wet and dry stems. Next to each stem title, I have a note section for some extra important guidance. For example 2, all the main features of my tracklist document are essentially the same. Again, the title portion has song title, key, beats per minute, and time signature. You can see my general notes section is way bigger this time. Because there are more tracks and more notes than the song in example 1, each folder got its own page. This is the page for the drums and percussion folder. Again, all my stem titles match the audio files verbatim. I have optional notes for each stem, and I have my stem count within each folder. A quick additional tip is to send your track list as a PDF and not a Word doc. It saves the engineer from accidentally erasing text when something crazy happens, like his asshole cat decides to do asshole cat things. Exporting based on headroom. This is a tad unprofessional to say, and it's not something I go by. But the bottom line is, if the engineer has all your properly exported stems that aren't clipping, and you send a decent reference track, it really doesn't matter what the output volume of the tracks are, and thus how much headroom you leave. But. This is a slippery slope. At the most standardized and professional level, all the stems you export should be around the same volume. So how do you export stems to a set headroom value without messing up your original rough mix? I'm glad you asked. This right here, this is my entire song. This is 2 minutes and 30 seconds. This is an EDM song. We're gonna use the bass drums as an example here. First thing that you're gonna wanna do is separate everything into groups by major category. I have drums, percussion, that's gonna be one folder. Instrument samples, that's gonna go into a separate folder. And vocals. Everything that are various shades of green right here, these are all my drums. I have everything set into this group, right? Ableton calls it a group. This is also essentially just a drum bus. Notice my volume is at 0. So say I want to export my bass drums to my set headroom, which is going to be negative 10 dB. These are what we already went over, layered samples, right? So these two samples come together to make one sound. I'm going to solo these. So we only have our main bass drum playing. So I have these levels for the bass drum set. Then I have my bass drum bus, and that is adjusted to a different level. And then that's coming out my 0 dB, which is going to my master channel. Let's look at our master. So it's coming out our master channel at negative 14.3 dB. So we have to go up 4.3 to get to negative 10. Now there's different ways you can do this. For Ableton, this utility plugin is great. It's really just a gain plugin. So anything that your program uses for a gain plugin, you can use. So this is our master volume right here. We know we need to go up 4.3. Go 4.3. Let's see what we come up with. Boom, 10 exactly. That's how easy it is. I have my end marker right here. I just put this here as a gauge for myself. So this is gonna go from 0 or from 1 over to 81. So export 81. I have my range from 1 to 81. I have 48,000 hertz, so 48 kilohertz, right? 2448. I have a WAV file. Bit depth is 24. Don't need an MP3. And then I would export this to my drum folder. And that's how you export to a set headroom. Personal bonus tip. I export all my stems to a uniform length no matter how much audio is on the original track. This isn't required, but it's something I like to do. A great example is this percussion track, which just has one teeny tiny little percussion fill on it within the entire song. As you saw from the headroom example that we just went over, I put an end marker on the song for myself to help mark the export boundaries. I do this because different programs handle both exporting and importing differently, and it leaves no question to where in the song this little piece of audio goes. Overall, any additional file size is minimal, and you're actually going to see why right now. Assembling the final project file. Everything for your final project file will be combined into one folder. More often than not, you're going to want to compress it into a zip file. It will contain the folders with all your stems, a reference track or two, and your track list document. Using the first song from the same examples that we've been using, I have 40 stems as 24, 48 stereo WAV files, 2 reference tracks, and my track list document. That compressed down to only 793 megabytes. Seeing as how services like Fiverr give you 5 gigs, that's easy peasy lemon squeezy. Be proud of this immaculate project file that you just created. You just leveled up. Chapter 4, Revisions. As I alluded to in the intro, this is where the magic happens, and this is where you, as the customer, can make or break a song. A good song mix is unfortunately always a compromise between the overall quality and the output volume versus the clarity of the individual details. At the same time, the engineer is going to try to get the mix so that you are happy with it. We'll look at the timestamp method, your revision request document, tips for your self-analysis of the master drafts the engineer sends you, and compromise, or not. Timestamps. Using timestamps to communicate spots for edits is a fairly effective method. An important thing to remember though is that the draft of the master that is sent back to you will often be at a different length than the original stems that you sent to the engineer. Usually engineers will cut off any unnecessary dead space already by the first draft, but different engineers do have different workflow. Ask the engineers what they prefer and or at least clarify whether you are referring to timestamps based on the original stems or the draft of the master. You'll see some real world examples in the next section. Revision request document. Ideally, your revision request document will be laid out as badass as your initial track list. Be clear, concise, correct. Be descriptive, but don't be overly wordy. Here's an example of one of mine. I have the song title and general notes section to start. I split this document up by song parts. This is a pretty effective method. As with the track list, I made tables with the exact stem titles of the originals and a notes section which includes the timestamps. Self-analysis of the drafts of the master. A huge factor, apart from the skill of the engineer, is you as the customer's own vision of the song and what you think sounds good. A good engineer is going to try to get the most pro-sounding product possible, all the while trying to keep you happy. Here's some tips. Second opinions. It's always a good idea, if possible, to get other people's ears in on the deal. Sometimes it doesn't even matter if they know what they're talking about, both musically or sonically. They're gonna hear things differently than you and give you a different perspective. This can be valuable because it can wake you up to something that your own biases didn't originally hear. Real-world audio analysis. What do I mean by this? I mean listening to your song on multiple sets of different speakers. When you do this, take notes each time on what and where you think revisions should happen. You'll be shocked to see how easily you start to see overlapping ideas that you've written down. These overlaps are a great place to start when requesting revisions. Personally, I always analyze masters through at least 5 sets of speakers. These include my car stereo, a set of headphones that have a decent bass frequency response, some audio system that has a fat subwoofer, a medium quality Bluetooth speaker, and yes, even my phone. We all know that cell phone speakers sound like shit, as they really only show the mids to the high frequencies of a mix. But you can hear how balanced the mids and highs are in terms of dynamics, and it shows you, sadly, how most people are gonna hear your song, especially when they first discover it. Studio analysis. If you're a little more advanced in the studio, run your draft through an EQ or spectrum analyzer. This really helps to see if there's too much bass frequency in relation to the overall mix, and you can visually see trouble spots that might have some harmonic oversaturation. Compromise. An annoyingly huge factor is the quality of the originally recorded tracks. The 2 worst elements here are large peaks and clipping in your recordings, and background noise, snow, buzz, hiss, etc. Peaks, valleys, and clipping. Don't expect too much if you record and send tracks that look like this. Check pop in the vocals. You'll have to be the one to compromise if this is what the engineer has to work with. I'm not being dramatic, it's just the facts, it's that simple. Background noise. Unfortunately, this isn't always user fixable and sometimes comes down to budget, since cheaper gear often has, but not always, a higher noise floor. I'm not going to get too far into this because it is getting off the main topic of this video, but I will do a video on this in the near future. Just understand that there are tools that audio engineers can sometimes use to get rid of background noise, but in the end, it generally means there will be compromised audio quality to some capacity.
Self-perception.
Guitar players, I'm going to pick on you. Y'all are notorious for wanting your parts brought up super loud in the mix.
If you can see, the numbers all go to 11.
But of course the result can be a crappy overall master, especially when it comes to what sounds are stacking on top of each other based on what's playing at the time. Sometimes artists have the opposite problem where they always think they're too loud in the mix and just want to blend in like a gnat's fart in a hurricane. It's really hard to listen to your own song or even analyze any of your own art from a third-party perspective. I have this problem 100% of the time. I will oftentimes tell an engineer, can you please change such and such, assuming it works with the final mix. But don't ever let this scare you. It never hurts to ask. You are the paying customer. And with that, boom! We're all done. This video ended up being longer than I had initially planned, so thanks for sticking around. If you have any other great ideas, war stories, complaints, suggestions, leave them in the comments below. Thanks for watching.